All right, here we are, everybody. Thanks for tuning back into Psychedelics today. Today, I'm joined by Logan Davidson from Texans for Greater Mental Health and a few other projects. Logan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Joe. How are you doing, man?
Lovely, lovely. So, we just had the chance to meet in person at the recent Ibogaine Summit, I'll call it for short, in Aspen. And that was lovely. But we had a chance to connect online a few times before, which is
hmm
great. Big fan of your works, and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great to finally meet you in person. I'm a big fan of your work as well, and it's been fun before and after the Aspen meeting, listening to all the different names that we've all given it: the Aspen Summit, Aspen Ibogaine Meeting 2.0.
What's the title?
I think technically it was the Aspen Ibogaine Meeting 2.0. AIM 2.0
Hmm,
is what I saw around a lot, but also
right
maybe
on.
that's AOL Instant Messenger 2.0, and we're going to re-enter the 90s.
Uh, there's ways in which that was more pleasant, but who knows? I don't know if I can go backwards. Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
So, excited to have you here. And before we really kind of dig into you as an individual, can you give us a high level of the groups and projects you're working on right now, and then we'll kind of like dig into you as an individual.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the executive director of Texans for Greater Mental Health. We're obviously a Texas-based, Texas-focused education, engagement, and advocacy organization, which just means that we wake up every day and figure out how to advance psychedelic medicines in Texas with a science-led, research-first approach, which aligns really well to the psychedelic political climate in the state of Texas. I'm also the legislative director for VETS, Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions, Marcus and Amber Capone's organization, where I get to work in concert with my colleague Khurshid Koja on all things policy and advocacy. I do a lot of state work and have been really fortunate to get to work in North Carolina with Gina Giorgio and the North Carolina Psychedelic Policy Coalition, Hawaii, the Clarity Project with Ashley Lukens. I'm through VETS involved in launching Valor, the Veterans Alliance for Leadership, Outreach, and Recovery, which is a project founded by VETS, Navy SEAL Foundation, Green Beret Foundation, and Wounded Warrior Project, focused on federal advocacy. And then I serve in, an amorphous, someday to be determined advisory role with Americans for Ibogaine, bringing the wisdom and lessons that we learned in Texas forward for them to use in other states and across the country.
Right on. One of the fun things I kept hearing in Aspen was, "How do we get our own Logan?" And I got to think that's funny, but I also for you, but I also have to think like, oh my God, my heart's going to explode because I'm, not getting enough rest because I'm doing so much, and it's not just you working in Texas, you're working all over the place, right? So it's yeah, it's got to be exhausting. So to get into that point, how did you get here? How did Ibogaine or psychedelics come on your radar as something you wanted to work on?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Heart Can Explode thing. I'm very ready for the holiday. But it is,
Yeah.
if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. And I do love what I do, and I don't think it has felt like work yet. Although something's going to happen in the next year to challenge that theory, I'm sure. I got into this. I started my career in politics, and especially legislative politics, when I was 19 years old. In 2014, interning in local congressional offices, and then working on my first campaign for a member of the Texas House, and then fell in love with that and just basically committed my entire life to politics and legislative service, both at the state and federal level. While that was happening, obviously, like a ton of other people, I had my own mental health struggles. Major depressive disorder and suicidal ideation was just a feature of my life for a really long time. And then when I was in college, I came to learn a little bit more about psychedelics, the way that they can help with that, especially the way that they could help veterans with PTSD and other conditions. My brother deployed to Africa when he was in the Army, serving in a civil affairs team. And so that was very personal to me. And so I had kind of these dual tracks, and it really was, my career. And then I was deeply interested in psychedelics, and especially psychedelic medicine, learned about the research happening at Hopkins, and never really thought that these two things were going to cross into one kind of, mission path. But in 2021, I went to work for State Representative Alex Dominguez, who, if you've ever seen Charlie Wilson's War, there's this phenomenon where this congressman who is of no relative importance, I think is what they say in the movie trailer, but he happens to sit on every single important committee to get what he's doing done. And that was Alex. He was on the appropriations committee. He was on one of the calendars committee. He was a vice chair. He was in leadership. He was a former prosecutor who himself had been really interested in this. He had two siblings who served. And he decided to file a bill to see if we could start a conversation on psychedelics. And that was HB 1802, which went on to be the first psychedelic research legislation passed in the country. Almost first piece of psychedelic reform legislation passed in the country, but Connecticut beat us by just a little bit. And huge credit to Jesse McLaughlin for getting that done. But so we passed that bill. That was the most important thing I'd ever done in my life up to that point. And I knew that, even while we were doing it, we all knew this was the biggest thing we were potentially ever going to work on. You could spend 80 years and never work on anything that's going to be as significant as that. And then about a year and a half later, I was recruited to come work at Tech Center Greater Mental Health by the founder, Eric Kozendar, who also brought Alex onto the board. He brought Lynette Averill, the researcher from Baylor College of Medicine, who was leading the 1802 trial and was our subject matter expert onto the advisory board. And the theory was, there was a team that got this done in Texas. So let's try to get as many people on that team back together and go keep on doing it. And that was almost 3 years ago to the day, pretty close, that I had that first conversation with Eric. And it's been a whirlwind ever since. Joined the vets team after that, got to work in a bunch of other states. And yeah, it's a really amazing thing to get to be able to work on your passion, to feel like you're doing good in the world and helping people, which is nice. Not always something you get working in politics, and especially in a state legislature. And that I get to, it's an emerging space for the most part, especially from my side of the world and the political legislative world. You don't really get to do anything new. The boundaries already exist, and you're just playing within this field. But with psychedelic medicine and psychedelics broadly, you're essentially, paving your own road. You're planting the sod of your own green field. So it's a really exciting place to work.
Yeah, it's not at all like a lot of other traditional fields where there's 100+ years of history. We're dealing, well, we have a lot of history here, but
right.
We have a lot of like new ground in terms of legislation and ways in which we could see this play out, and we can have a lot of impacts here, for good and bad.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one of the better things we all have going for us here is that we all care that this is done well and right. And while we might not agree on particulars, sometimes we're all working towards what we think is the right thing, which, what could be better than that?
That's right. Yeah. The common cause is great. And it is always one of the things I really enjoy about some of the conferences and summits we get to go to. Aspen didn't count as much because everybody was so Ibogaine focused, but you'll get someone who's ardently decrim and opposes medicalization, and someone who's ardently opposed to decrim and only wants medicalization. And you'll just see them off in the corner, excitedly talking to each other about how they're wrong and you're wrong, and here's my vision for it. And I think the right answer and where great things come is from the middle of that tension. You got to have the two opposing viewpoints. You got to have the whole spectrum, get everybody together, have some conversations, and figure out what the best path forward is. And that's also like our philosophy for state advocacy. Every state's going to do what's right for that state. And then the federal government gets to look and pick and choose what they think worked best and ditch what they think didn't work.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So, was there a particular angle on the Ibogaine story that made it seem like a really compelling substance to be working on?
Yeah, I mean, the relationship the special operations community has to Ibogaine. So that psilocybin bill we passed in 2021, Marcus Capone was one of our key witnesses. Morgan Luttrell was a key witness for us. They all were essentially telling the story of Ibogaine. We never, if you go listen to their testimony, none of them ever say it was psilocybin, it was Ibogaine, it was psychedelic assisted therapy. But even then, all those years ago, I knew this was headed towards Ibogaine, whether it's 4 years or 40 years. The psychedelic space is going to get to Ibogaine. And it's an incredibly powerful medicine, obviously. The impact on the brain is incredible, especially traumatic brain injury, its ability to resolve opioid withdrawal syndrome. And so it's powerful. The stories are incredibly compelling, but really, I think the thing that made it most compelling to legislators and then obviously made it the vehicle for which I would do a lot of work is the relationship the special operations community has to it.
Yeah. So I guess let's characterize the substance for a little bit. So it comes from Africa, generally speaking.
Right.
We've actually found ibogaine in some South American plants. I'm sure you've kind of heard rumor of that here and there,
Hmm.
which is interesting. Um, you know, Pangea and all. But I
Yeah,
think like
exactly.
I think there's some interesting conversations to be had around like where does it come from? How do we become fair to the people that had this before? And what I loved about the Aspen meeting was that the Blessings of the Forest crew was there, and they're kind of a group that's really helping get some sort of reciprocity. And you and Brian
Hmm.
really insisted that you're going to work really hard to make that happen. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. As we said in Aspen, no one has the right answer on that point yet. There's a couple of layers to it, right? Just thinking about like the Texas project, setting aside Texas's politics for a second, which definitely played a role in how that bill came into being. But it's FDA approved clinical research, FDA approved DEA licensed clinical research, which to date, broadly speaking, is synthetic only. Right. There's some exceptions. You have Dr. Sue Sisley, who successfully sued the DEA. There's like some limited exceptions to this, but the general rule, if you're doing clinical research, it's got to be synthetic. So there is an inherent incompatibility between the way these medicines work and the way that both like our community in the United States and the international psychedelic community kind of interact with these medicines in this world, and the way that like our medical system can fit it. So there's an ongoing process, and I only just kind of dipped my toes in at the federal level, but from advocates who are trying to change the FDA's attitude on that, at least create some sort of exception where you are allowed to do natural or semi-naturally derived non-synthetic substances. So that's one track. I think the big key is not only reciprocity, though, and making sure that we honor where it comes from, and that we try to not be exploitative the way that folks have been for so many generations and centuries, but also to tap into the wisdom. Right, Joseph Parsulia, I think, speaks really, really well on this. But it's you've got some Western medical practitioners who are going to come in, and this is going to be their very first experience with ibogaine or a substance like this, and they're going to try to identify the best practices and codify those and publish them, and Aetna will provide reimbursement for that and everything. And then you have folks in Gabon who have been working with this medicine for centuries, generations, who have a deep inherent wisdom, who understand how it works. They may not understand how it works in the terms of biological chemistry or anything like that, but they can explain it from a spiritual perspective, and also I think from a practical perspective. So part of it is obviously the reciprocity, right? But also, within that is not only financial reciprocity, but also hopefully for those of us in the West, sort of a wisdom reciprocity and a cultural reciprocity as well.
Yeah, it's going to be really fascinating and interesting to see how we can do some sort of like cultural exchange there and actually learn from them. I've got a lot to say on it, but let's not do that here.
Yeah.
So, let's see. So, famously, Texas put in a lot of money to this kind of project to develop ibogaine as an FDA approved drug. Can you give us a little bit of that story? Like what happened there?
Yeah. Well, the story of Texas putting in the money. There's a thing that happened a long time ago, and then we fast forward. So over 100 years ago, they struck oil at Spindletop, and Texas's wealth as a state skyrocketed. Relative to everything else. And that's a really important factor because we were able to get what we got done in Texas because Texas was sitting on a really significant budget surplus. It wasn't opioid settlement funds. It wasn't out of this dedicated research fund. Texas we've collected more money than we thought we were going to over the past few years. We had tens of billions of dollars in surplus funds. So coming and asking for the appropriation was really interesting because at no point in the process did anybody say we can't afford this. There were plenty of people who said you can't have lots of money to research your African psychedelic. What are you talking about? But no one said, oh, we can't afford this. And that's a stark contrast to some other states that are supportive of psychedelics that don't have the same budgetary position that we do. So that's an important kind of fact and a factor in what played out. The story of the Texas Ibogaine Initiative is actually quite an efficient story. It all started last summer. Governor Perry and a few other people engaged Brian in a conversation and said, you've been working on Ibogaine in a bunch of other states. We think there's an opportunity in Texas to do something big. We think this should be the big thing that we do. Do you want to come do this? That's when Brian and I connected late summer and the early fall. There was one big in-person team meeting in October, and then it was off to the races. And you had this big coalition that ebbed and flowed and grew over time. You had the Rogan podcast, we got the bill filed, like all of these things kind of come together. And another important thing is Texas is in legislative session every odd numbered year for 140 days. So, the conversation started last summer. 12 months basically from when that conversation started, we were going to be at a time working on this. And so it was a really rapid, bringing together of folks. Lynette Averill was back involved, who helped pass HB 1802. The VMHLC was at the table. Brian obviously was leading pretty significantly. He and Rick Perry did the famous Joe Rogan podcast. Vets came to the table at the very beginning of this year and really supercharged the effort and took advocacy lead. And I will say I am biased. I work with them, but even before I worked for Vets, I was a strong believer that when Vets is at the tip of the spear, you generally see advocacy success. You've seen it twice in California, and then obviously twice in Texas. And so we decided to do it, and then it became about finding the right author. And Representative Cody Harris, who filed HB 3717, was the right author. Not only was he a powerful member of the House, great relationships across the conservative movement, credibility with the minority party, he also knew about Ibogaine before that Joe Rogan episode. He had heard about it on Sean Ryan. He has some family members with neurodegenerative conditions, and that was where his real personal interest came from. He was aware of the veteran stories and found them to be incredibly compelling, and that we should make this treatment available for those folks that shouldn't have to leave the country. He learned more about its ability to treat addiction, but he also brought his own personal passion for this. And we then got Senator Tan Parker, who actually, I mentioned that first political job back in 2014. I was working for then Representative Tan Parker, and he's a prominent conservative in the Senate, now the chairman of the House Republican Caucus. So you had the right guys to get this done. And we started from there, and then ran the most aggressive, most efficient, time-constrained, stressful legislative campaign I've ever been a part of. I think Brian and I got very close for how many times we had to get on the phone to try to unravel and solve some Rubik's Cube that had just been thrown up at us. The number of times he called me and said, "I've got a hot potato and I'm passing it to you." I have no skin left on my hands from juggling hot potatoes. And then all of a sudden in May, we found out we were going to get the $50 million. I knew from the beginning, we're going to pass this thing. The legislature's ready. Folks are going to support this. But how much money is it going to be? And someday, if you haven't yet, I hope you have Brian on the podcast and he can tell you that I was encouraging him in January, we should be willing to take 1 million. We should be willing to take 1,000 and come back and get more money later. But let's get this established. And he said, no, 50 million. And then he went into a negotiation with our state leaders and he said, no, 50 million. I think you maybe have heard part of the story, this infamous hour and 30-minute meeting that he went into that was supposed to last half an hour. And then all of a sudden we had the 50. And that was, such a huge moment. I actually think that day felt like the bigger achievement than when the bill was actually signed into law, because that was the thing that seemed inconceivable, even though Texas had the funds, to go from 2.2 million for psilocybin in 2021, 25x that to 50 for Ibogaine, a substance people hadn't heard of that's so far back in the drug development process. But that's where it really came from. And I think there's a few key things. I'll finish this long answer with just a few key things that the legislature really latched in on. One was a treatment for opioid use disorder. That was huge. Two was the stories from special operations veterans of how it helped them, whether it be Marcus Luttrell, Marcus Capone, Chris Thompson, but also especially Chase Rowans, who was able to connect the story of the special operations community to the addiction community. He was injured in a training jump. The VA prescribed him Percocets and sent him on a decade plus, odyssey with addiction that he was finally delivered from a couple of years ago by Ibogaine. And those stories were so powerful and so compelling. The data from the Stanford study was great, but it was really the stories. And then the final piece of the story was the spouses. Amber Capone, Becca Thompson, Kristen Grenier came and told the story of what it was like to be right on the edge of losing their husband, of their kids losing their fathers, and then them going away essentially for a weekend, coming back, and all of a sudden dad's home again, and what that means to the family and what it means to the community. So that's how it came together, and a little bit of how we were able to pass that bill.
Yeah, I love that. So much energy and action. It must have been edge of your seat often.
The whole way through.
Let's take one. Yeah, that Brian telling the story on stage was really something. Yeah, and I have to say I really appreciate the kind of dynamic duo feel you two have. Like it
Mhm.
feels, you show up with a lot and he shows up with a lot, and it's very different,
Yes, yeah.
mhm.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I do think we're a dynamic duo. The evidence supports it as well. But yeah, we are very different people. He's, this towering figure with that mane of red hair and that deep Appalachian accent, and I'm, a kid out of the suburbs of Dallas Fort Worth, who still looks a little bit like I'm in college at times. And Brian is such an incredible storyteller and orator, and just a real it is hard not to be inspired and fired up every day when you're working with Brian, because every time he talks, it's the halftime pep talk that you're getting in the state championship, and then getting sit back out onto the field. It's a really great partnership.
I haven't had him on yet to talk about this. I really want to, but there was this moment. He was on stage with Sue Sicily at South by Southwest, and
Hmm.
Brian was kind of like laying out a lot of his history in Kentucky and a lot of the
Hmm.
problems that were in Kentucky.
Hmm.
Um, do you know if he's still developing those ideas or working on that story at all about like what he encountered there, or is he just kind of head down on this other stuff?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Um, I think he's pretty much head down on this other stuff. There, Kentucky's on the Americans for Ibogaine list. They've got, supporters in the legislature. They've obviously got really strong community support. A lot of dust got kicked up around it back when it was the Kentucky Ibogaine Initiative. So he's certainly still working in Kentucky, still wants to bring it home. I do think he's quite busy looking at other states, and coming out of Aspen, there's even more states on the agenda now. But I do think he still has some time and attention for Kentucky.
Cool. Yeah, I love hearing that. Yeah, I'll get with him on the more controversial aspects of that because it's so exciting and interesting, and I really want to see him get loud with that.
It's
Um,
like one of the first psychedelic advocacy political stories that has kind of real political intrigue in it, right?
mm,
There's
mm.
actually, there were hit pieces put in newspapers, and, shadow fighting between state leaders, all with the backdrop of a, gubernatorial election. It's sort of a made for TV story in a lot of ways.
Oh, yeah. Maybe I'll try to buy the rights. That's
Yeah.
great.
Oh, there you go. That's a good idea. Yeah.
um, that's funny. So, all right. One of the things that gets interesting when we start talking about ibogaine is we have so much hope for it to
Mhm.
help with addiction, in particular interrupting opioid addiction in a really unique way, and then other addictions too, but
Right.
then other things like this head injury story out of Stanford that vets, and I forget, maybe it was Ambio was involved
Hmm.
there, and
Yep.
then
Ambio.
there was then yeah, brain injury, PTSD. There's a lot of potential conditions that could be treated.
Hmm.
The one thing that comes up often to say, "Oh, I don't. This is never going to happen," or like this is going to take a long time, is the cardiac risk. And
Hmm.
have you, like, medically, it seems like we can handle it really well. I would
Yeah.
say that not all of the retreats are handling it medically super skillfully.
Hmm.
We're still on occasion seeing deaths.
Hmm.
Um, what, like, are politicians or are people in the development like overly concerned about the cardiac risk, or do they feel like it's manageable from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would not say folks are overly concerned. I think they're appropriately concerned. There's a couple
Mhm.
of dynamics here. One, there is this kind of overarching faith in the ability of our medical system to handle this, whether it's creating a solution like an Ibogaine analog like Gilgamesh has worked on that removes that cardiotoxic risk, whether it's having, the acute care necessary to respond in the event of an adverse event, or just learning more about a delivery protocol to mitigate and hopefully eventually reduce to zero the risk of a cardiotoxic event. Um, but I do think they are, so there is that. I do think another piece of it is the risk inherent in any sort of significant medical event. So from the perspective of like a mental health treatment, the idea that it's potentially fatal is sort of alien to us. Like, oh, you're going to go into EMDR and something can go wrong and all of a sudden you die. Like that doesn't really happen, right? But if you think about it in the terms of it's similar to like a surgery, it's actually a lower risk or a very comparable risk to that. You can die of a surgical complication from getting your tonsils out. And you have to weigh the pros and cons and make a decision, in consultation with your doctor and your family, on what is best for you. And I think there's an attitude that Ibogaine and other psychedelic assisted therapies, but especially Ibogaine, kind of falls into the same category, that it's not such a significant risk that it is really any more risky than a lot of the other medical treatments that are relatively common. And then the kind of final component that I would offer is the risk of not doing it. So I think this was a big part of the conversation we had around MDMA. I think we've seen it around other substances. We know for sure this many people are dying of deaths of despair, suicide, alcoholism, drug overdose. We know we're here, and available treatments have us right here. And there's a treatment that maybe brings us down here, but then, maybe as a result of that treatment, you see suddenly an uptick of deaths in another category. Not to be really cold about it, but kind of what's the cost benefit analysis? And at a certain point, isn't the current level of death unacceptable? And we have to try something new, even if there is some risk with that new treatment. Are more people going to die from suicide as a result of not getting treatment for PTSD or traumatic brain injury, or die of a drug overdose, than may die as a result of this treatment? And I think we don't necessarily have the data on that, but I do think just from a back of the napkin kind of math, you would see the overall deaths come way down if these substances were approved as a treatment. And that, I think, is something that comes into play a lot for policymakers, because 17 to 44 veterans die by suicide every day. That's a statistic that we all know. Used to be 17 to 22, revised estimate 17 to 44. The danger of being a decision maker, whether it's in a state legislature or certainly the federal legislature, is you get hit with numbers like that all the time. And you can become very comfortable with that. 1 in 4 children, are food insecure. 1 in 5 children living in poverty. 17 to 44 veterans dying by suicide every day. That the idea of taking a risk to solve it becomes like somehow more stress inducing because you are comfortable with this number. But for those who are not comfortable with that number, it's basically a no-brainer that we have to do something. This is unacceptable. And, we must do right and risk the consequences. And that, I think, is an attitude that they bring to the table.
Yeah. It's definitely important to have this conversation and talk about this cost benefit analysis. And there is an aspect where it feels cold. There's also an aspect where the existing treatments are garbage. And this is kind of where I exist in the psychedelic ecosystem often. It's like, guys, there's risk here. There's a little bit of expense here, but if we're doing cost benefit analysis, total cost analysis, and then like downstream benefits, it's staggering, getting people back to their families, the integrated family life that's possible after, and the benefits from that versus deep addiction and harm.
Yeah, absolutely. Elliot Marseille, I think, is doing great research on that out at Berkeley, and his research has been hugely helpful in the advocacy space of kind of laying out the cost of not doing this, the cost efficiency of doing it. And if you want to have a particularly American conversation, how about people just being able to show up to work at their full capacity again? The economic benefit of someone not being in the depths of depression or addiction is quantifiable and significant. And that's one of the other kind of exciting things you get to talk about. Like when you're thinking of the advocacy space, we have 150 members of the Texas House, 31 members of the Texas Senate. Basically, all of them are going to make their decision a little bit differently, but they might get lumped into groups. And there are some who it's the data on how effective the treatment is, some it's the spirituality aspect, some it's just the anecdote, some it's that the guy next to them is voting for it. And so being able to frame it in the conversation of the long-term impact of this is not just saving this life, but saving all the lives around them. Because we also don't conceive of it really the other way. We don't, someone dies by suicide. That's tragic. They're gone. How sad. But you don't think about the fact that essentially every life immediately connected to them has been impacted, and some of them can be ruined by that reality. And so again, that comes back to the what is the risk here, and what is the greater risk, and what is the greater cost to make an effective treatment available, even with some physical risk, even with some risk that it won't work. That's also another piece. It's not going to work for everybody, but it's going to work for a lot more people than current treatments are, right? I mean, essentially the current treatment for opioid addiction is traditional rehab and then abstinence, which if you've ever heard Brian talk about it, that's got like an 8 to 12% success rate. You flip the script over to Ibogaine and you're talking about 8 to 12% is now the population that will not be successful versus the successful population. So there's a lot there, and a lot of really interesting angles and dynamics to that conversation.
Yeah. So I wonder what the FDA thinks and how they would want to manage that. I hope there's room for them to understand and characterize the cardiac risk better. I personally think it's under characterized, the cardiac risk, and as a result, not as well understood as we should, have it, so that we can actually be speaking skillfully about it. I think there's clearly best practices out there for how do we keep people safest. Barsuglia and Eastman have a lot to say on this, and I think plenty of other doctors too. There's ways to do this really well. It's tragic when we see people get hurt, but also there is this element of, and I'm not trying to do victim blaming here, but people, when they often die in these scenarios, they're really, really weak from addiction.
Right.
Their heart's really damaged, and as a result, can they handle this stress? It's not always the case.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's why the medical screening is so important, but also why the research is so important. Part of why we don't understand it is we have not been able to research it since the passage of the Controlled Substance Act, which puts us in this perpetuating cycle of, we think it's effective. We don't fully understand the risks, and the burden to do the research to understand those risks is so high that we're really limited in how much we can do. And until we see FDA approval for at least one psychedelic compound, maybe that then changes the conversation on scheduling for all of them, or just each one individually, we won't see the depth and breadth of research that we really need to fully understand how to treat people whose conditions can be effectively treated with these substances.
Yeah. Amazing. So, do you think that there's impact on how this development's going to be seen in the United States if certain business people aren't operating as safely as they could be, safely and as high performance, wise as they could be?
Yeah, I mean, the stakes are really high, right? We talk somewhat often in the space, and I don't think this is unique to Ibogaine, but very often in the broader psychedelic advocacy space, if something goes wrong in one of these clinical trials, and even an international retreat, if it's a particularly prominent person, if the treatment isn't effective enough, anything like that can take all of the momentum that we have and send it back the opposite direction. Right. So that's certainly a concern. And so making sure that it's done safely and effectively is so important. I think, you mentioned business, which is, I think, an apt thing to mention, because a lot of times, and it's not a criticism, it's an observation, business will cut corners. They want to move as quickly as they can. They want to reduce costs. They want to make it, they're serving their bottom line shareholders a particular end goal that isn't necessarily the treatment and betterment of their patient. That's not all businesses, right? That's some of them. And so making sure that how this goes out, especially in the early years of this Ibogaine drug development movement, the Iboverse, as Brian dubbed it, is absolutely critical, because the potential consequences of something going wrong in any capacity in this are cannot be understated. Cannot be overstated. The risks cannot be overstated.
Absolutely. The late great Nolan Williams had some really great lines about the promise of this molecule, because he described it really well as a sort of very strange molecule, very alien from what we're used to in terms of pharmacology in humans. And he kind of put it as kind of a Gen 2, Gen 3 kind of psychedelic. And I think it goes beyond that in a lot of ways. I think there's so much potential here. Are you beyond addiction and beyond,
Hmm.
PTSD? Are you
Right.
hearing about any kind of like promising futures with people kind of modifying the molecule? I know, let's not get too into Gilgamesh because they're made it shorter, made it maybe a little safer, but
Right.
it's beyond that kind of frontier.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, innovation is at the core of like so much of what we do in the medical field, especially in the United States, but everywhere. It also, I think, would be naive not to note that innovation offers businesses like unique edges over one another. If you have a proprietary molecule, you can patent that molecule, take it to market, have maybe like a better profit space than one who doesn't have a proprietary molecule. The things that I've heard about, and I think you've heard of this too, and we're talking about it with LSD and with psilocybin and with Ibogaine and all of them, is removing the trip. We've had a lot of people talk about, can you replicate the benefits without the psychedelic experience? I think that's a totally understandable and correct conversation to have. I'm not a scientific expert, medical expert, mental health expert. I'm an expert in essentially nothing except the state legislative committee process. But certainly it seems a lot of the researchers, the folks who are smarter than me, think you can't really separate the trip, that these two things have to work together, the physiological and the spiritual. But that, I think, is a debate that we're going to continue to see play out for years and maybe forever, because I also think, a little bit, let the market decide, let patients decide what they need, let people decide, but make it all available in a safe, therapeutic, regulated way that you know what's in it and you know what you're getting. One of the other things that I've heard, yeah, shortening it obviously is key to a lot of people, but then, and neurodegenerative conditions come to mind as people think about Alzheimer's and Parkinson's related to Ibogaine, or think about the opioid use disorder related to Ibogaine. If we better understand the molecule, can you tinker with it to create a version of Ibogaine that is actually more effective for those neurodegenerative conditions versus an addiction issue, and vice versa, and really all conditions, and that you can take this one thing that works pretty well for everything and then modify it a little bit and make it work really well for these specific things. But part of it is we don't understand it. I don't want to say it all. That would be, I think, a disservice to Nolan and Gould and Dolly and everyone involved in Ibogaine research. But there's so much of it that we don't understand. And you get into conditions that we are aware people are going to international treatments, international retreats to receive treatment on. Parkinson's is a good example, but you don't have the Stanford Parkinson's trial. You have the Stanford Ibogaine trial dealing with special operations veterans. So until we get that research and better understand how it works, we won't really know the scope of our ability to tinker with the molecule and develop different compounds to treat different conditions. But those are the things I'm hearing. And the last one is what I think is really exciting, the idea that you can kind of optimize the molecule for a specific condition.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know who some of the leaders thinking about Ibogaine and Parkinson's are on the research side offhand?
No, not offhand.
Hmm.
I'll be honest, I've been so focused on the TBI PTSD piece
Hmm.
for years. OUD just got in. Someone who I know, who I have heard speak, very intelligently and effectively on it, who I think, just given the depth and breadth of her existing research, would be a natural person to lead in that space, is Gould Dolan.
Yeah.
I've been at two different summit conference type things where I've heard her speak on it, and both times there's been a question on the neurodegenerative piece. But other than that, no, I'm not sure who's leading.
Right on. Yeah, I'll check in with Ghoul on that. It's always an interesting topic to me because so many people are suffering
Yeah,
from so many
we
different
have.
conditions, but neurodegenerative stuff just so gutting in
So gutting,
particular.
and I think like terrifying to a lot of people, because once it starts, it's, there's no stopping it.
Hmm.
I will say, just as like a little anecdote, we did this Ibogaine kind of educational event in San Antonio a couple of weeks ago, as we're kind of spreading the news across Texas that, we're leading on this issue. And there's a gentleman who came. He had come to an event with us in Austin, and he came to San Antonio and spoke, who was a Parkinson's patient, and Ibogaine essentially gave him the ability to walk again. Just an incredibly powerful story. He had a slightly different treatment model than what we're seeing like Ambio for the veteran population, for example. But it was great to have someone come and tell that story, and I think offer that new ray of hope in this whole space.
One person uh, stood up in Aspen and made a really interesting point, and I thought it was really, really useful given kind of the hype cycle that can exist around this stuff. And
Hmm.
you know, um, this stuff still requires a lot of support.
Yeah.
It's not a one shot, 2-day treatment, right? It could, for opioid use disorder or other addictions, be part of a couple weeks or a month
Hmm.
process, right? Which makes it look a little bit more like a traditional rehab with an expensive drug intervention. But
Hmm.
Brian talks a lot about how the um, traditional uh, rehab is a we're kind of chasing good money after bad in a lot of ways because the
Hmm.
performance just seems really low there. But this would actually, based on our speculations, perform really well. Can you talk about, like, this kind of like hype cycle that might want to remove this need for additional psychological support services around this
Yeah.
treatment? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, let's focus in on Ibogaine, but also it
Yeah.
exists like with all of these molecules, right?
Hmm.
I think one part of it is this. I think it is human. I think it is also especially American, and I say that as a very very proud American and proud Texan. But this like one and done. Here's the fix. You have a headache. Here's an Advil. You're done. You have this condition. Here's the treatment. You're done. We, even, you think about, I don't know about you, I played rugby in college. How many of my friends got surgery and then skipped the physical therapy component so they could get back on the field and play again? And I think that is like a perfect, at least close to perfect analogy for the way this works. Is Ibogaine is like having surgery on your knee or your shoulder. And if you don't go do the physical therapy after, and if you also don't do the prep before the surgery, you're just going to get hurt again and maybe have a catastrophic injury compared to what your prior injury was. But I think there is this desire for it to be really simple, and you go do this over the weekend, and you're all better. I also think there's a cost thought to it. How do you make it more accessible? Well, let's just window it down to the smallest, the most minimal possible delivery of care we can, and then that's the floor. And if you want anything above that, it's extra, instead of standardizing the necessary treatment that goes around it, which also I think is maybe like a very American proclivity. um,
Hmm.
and then there's also, I think there are some people who in this space, so much is driven by personal experience and anecdote right now. And you have a ton of people who I think very honestly and accurately describe that Ibogaine was a new beginning, but then the work really began. And it's mindfulness, it's exercise, it's diet, it's gave them the ability to kind of retake control of their life. I think there are also people who say, I did Ibogaine over the weekend and I'm good. I'm all better. I'm fine. I don't need to go do all of those things. And so I do think there's something incumbent as we explore the research side of this to try to make sure that we're researching the difference in outcomes from people who do the integration, who do the therapy after, who do the prep, even who stay in touch with their cohort and have a peer support element to it, versus those who don't, and track those outcomes. I know Dr. Greg Fonzo at UT Austin's McGill Center at the Dell Medical School is definitely very interested. And is it just the psychedelic, or is it the psychedelic assisted therapy, or is it somewhere in between, or somewhere outside of that binary? So yeah,
One of my favorite ones here, Logan, is, I think it was Usona ran a trial a while ago with people under the influence of anesthesia and psilocybin to
mm,
see if there were benefits, and there were benefits, which is fascinating and really challenging to a lot of people in the psychedelic space who think it needs to be both. Or, I
yeah, yeah. It's and I like and again, I'm not an expert or anything, but I think we should all maintain curiosity as we move forward and never be too certain. It's very dangerous to be certain about anything, because if you're even like 5% wrong on what you're certain about, it can kind of lead to your house of cards crumbling, even if there actually was a really good foundation. So I think we don't yet, we definitely don't know how these work. I think we don't yet know the best way to deliver care with psychedelics. I think that's something we're going to learn about over the next few years. And I'll even go like a little further. I think we're going to get these drugs approved, get them into the world, and then still have at least another few years of refining the way that we deliver care. Because I think that's just the reality of how basically every treatment and medication goes. You get it out there, and then you find out more of what it can be used for. Think about Wellbutrin, right? A
Mhm.
treatment for depression and a number of other conditions, and also an off-label, very effective treatment for ADHD. And until it got into the world, we didn't know that. And so there's just so much more we're going to learn.
Yeah, amen to that. A story I like to tell, just to like further this point, is um, I I was in chronic pain from probably age like 22 to like 33, 35, something like that. Um, really intense MDMA and psilocybin use actually helped it go away.
Hmm.
No clinician really made a meaningful difference in it over time, but it was
Yeah.
me. But there was a lot of context around that. It wasn't um, just the drug. There was
Yeah.
social and different activities going on and stuff like that. So it was really fascinating and
Yeah.
worth noting.
Yeah, for sure. Something that I think, and I think we may have talked about this offline at some point. I've kind of waxed poetic on it for the last few months. Is and I'm one of the people I think who has kind of helped make this happen. But we're so focused on the medicalized version of psychedelics, and then there's kind of the ritualized and theogenic church spiritual side of it. But some of the most incredible stories that you'll hear are people who did kind of heal alone or heal in a context of friends and community. And we want to make sure that people are accessing care safely, and maybe the compounds they're accessing in the underground or from illicit sources are not there. So I'm not in any way endorsing this, but you hear about people who go to a music festival with their best friends, right? And they have this experience, and it's a set and setting, and they're with people who they're able to process things. And whether it's a physical condition or a mental condition, there's a whole element to the way that psychedelics work, even from the treatment perspective, that we're not really able to engage in because of the sort of strict limitations of advocacy and research. But to your point, there are all these people who have these stories about, I got it, I used it in my own setting, my own kind of container, and here are the benefits that I saw. But you can't get that published in a journal, at least not yet.
So we're kind of working on case series like that. There's all sorts of really interesting N of ones that are finally getting put
Hmm.
into literature. I work at the Psychedelics and Pain Association. We're seeing a lot of
Oh
that
yeah.
kind of stuff. Serious like snowmobile accidents or ski accidents. One of my friends, actually, Logan, he had a really bad skiing or snowboarding accident in South America, total paralysis, never going to walk again, months and months at the rehab hospital, was doing mushrooms at a music festival. Months later, his toes actually started moving and now he's walking,
Yeah, yeah.
psychedelics.
It's there's a guy here who had a stroke who, told his doctor he was going to do it. There was a conversation, but who similar used psilocybin and had a dramatically accelerated recovery timeline compared to other people. And those are things that I think are so interesting. And one of the big reasons it would be great to see the federal government start putting significant funding towards psychedelic research, and even other states, is there being a pot of money to better understand how that works. And if it is a safe and effective treatment, make it available to everybody, not just the folks who know where to access, these medicines and how to use them.
Yeah. My final thing on this thing is the recent trial with IV DMT for people in strokes that looked
Hmm.
really, really good. And I would be really curious to see what kind of like a low dose infusion of Ibogaine would do for a similar population, given what we know about TBI now. So fascinating frontiers, everybody. It's
Yeah,
endless.
yeah, really exciting stuff. And even once we answer some of those questions, Joe, it will produce infinite new questions as we continue to go on this journey.
I wouldn't have it any other way. So I want to talk about national security concerns and psychedelics. And you know,
Yeah.
I love this kind of conversation. So um do you ever see the series Homeland?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, I think this is a really cool like kind of case, right, of a person in a pretty, sensitive position in the government needing psychiatric care and not necessarily getting, it's a little more complicated than that, not getting what they
Hmm.
needed.
Right.
And I think we see that regularly. People with top clearances, really, serious info. And sometimes they can't get the help they need inside the existing healthcare apparatus of the armed services or whatever it is.
Hmm.
Sometimes they're doing cash pay with a clinician that is wildly, not on the books, and
Right.
getting that care. And then we have um, service members receiving drugs overseas, through different means. And, that's kind of wild. Sometimes they're exposing themselves to legal risk by buying
Hmm.
locally, which could induce some sort of compromise situation. And then if we look at scenarios like psychedelic psychotherapies or, interventions like Ibogaine, received illicitly,
Hmm.
you you then kind of have an individual that has compromise over somebody with really, serious intelligence. And I'm not saying anybody in particular is a bad actor necessarily here. Like, I'm not naming names, put it that way. And then, what does that mean for us as a nation? And this comes from us shooting ourselves in the foot with um, the Controlled Substances Act
Right.
and
Yeah.
generally, like, we did this to ourselves, put ourselves in a compromised position. And should we? And what's cool here is that it looks like there's a path towards some sort of availability,
Yeah.
but we're still exposed right now. It's a real living threat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we have socially put ourselves in these positions, various different positions, over many, many decades. You think about, there was a time especially in the United States, and not just the United States, where even, being a homosexual was something that could be used against you and could end your professional career or essentially destroy your personal life. Fortunately, we are past that, most of the way past that. But you look back and it's okay. We created this framework by which we could be exploited, by which we were vulnerable, and it was an entirely a human-made social construct. I think the Controlled Substances Act is a really good example of that as well. Kind of like you noted, there's lots of consequences of the CSA, more than we could get into in even a 3-hour podcast probably. But yeah, one of the biggest ones is all of a sudden we made accessing this care something that put an individual at risk, and then by extension puts an entire community or an entire country at risk. And no, I don't think we should. I think we should be careful, right, about the way folks can access this. And I'm very optimistic that in the next few years we start to see an acceleration of reform and reconsideration at the federal level that will include, I imagine, national security concerns. But it's something we see. The military is not necessarily, and the national security apparatus too, at the forefront of change, right? They usually kind of lag behind it a little bit. And so I think you'll see differences for folks who are in the veteran community, maybe who have a security clearance, than you will active duty service members. One silver lining here is that it is something people are thinking about. You look at the Douglas Mike Day Act, which was passed as the Crenshaw-Luttrell Amendment, led by Dan Crenshaw and Morgan Luttrell, two congressmen from Texas, shameless plug for the Lone Star State, and also both former Navy SEALs. And that legislation allows active duty service members to participate in this clinical research. And that was historic and essentially a first of its kind. And that, I think, is the first small step in the right direction towards folks being able to access this care, not compromise themselves, not lose their livelihood. That's another piece of it. Say you have a top security clearance, you don't want to be compromised, but this is what you've done your entire life. You have folks in that side of the world who entered their career at 18 or 19. That's all they've done forever. So there is no real choice of, do I keep this or do I give it up? They have to do it. And if they want to survive, in a lot of cases, they have to sometimes engage in a treatment that can compromise that security clearance. So it's a very fascinating space to play in. It's a relatively small population, so it doesn't get a ton of attention. But it is one that I think at least major policymakers are thinking about. Both in, I think, if we're honest, both about making sure that people in that population can access care, but also making sure humans are going to do what humans are going to do. So making sure that we're not going to be compromised or vulnerable as a result of that.
Yeah, I think it's super important. And yeah, I think there's so many ways in which this is a thing people could be looking at. Did you see the recent grant from ARPA-H, kind of like a DARPA affiliate?
I did. Yeah. I did.
100
Very
million?
exciting stuff. Yeah, I think that's right.
That sounds right. It was just yesterday, everybody. So this hasn't been assimilated yet into everything we do, but fascinating amount of money coming from the feds, which is a huge move.
Yeah. Sorry, I just went and pulled up the email that I got about it, and it is $100 million for the effort confirmed.
Yeah, amazing.
So,
it's fascinating to me that, like, the military apparatus has to actually step in when realistically federal science funding could really kind of do a big part here. And I'm a board member at the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition with Melissa Levisani, and I'm really hopeful for her efforts at the federal level to hopefully unlock a lot of money. And there's this kind of like exponential waterfall effect, I think, that would impact projects like yours with Ibogaine and any other psychedelic project, just because there's far more papers that everybody could be working with and just scaffolding the science and medicine.
Oh, totally. I mean, that is, I think, It's hard to pinpoint what like the, high water moment is going to be, but I think unlocking significant federal dollars, like from my perspective, has to be it. The largest funder of medical research on the planet is the federal government of the United States, and we're
Mhm.
essentially on the sidelines in this space. Um, and credit to the philanthropists that have driven this so far. Credit to the states that have put money into research. Credit to the small amount of money that the federal government has put in. But we all know we're dealing with a small puddle of water compared to the ocean that exists in broader federal medical research. And so someday we just got to get our puddle of water into that ocean.
So speaking of oceanic pools of cash, the big pharma groups, like what are you all kind of speculating on about big pharma generally in terms of when might they come to the table? Because they have plenty of money too, and they can do
Yeah.
things pretty quickly.
Yeah. I think, well, the issue of big pharma generally is, like, probably one of the most difficult touch points in this space. um, I'll offer my speculation. I won't speak for anybody else. I think over the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to see major pharmaceutical companies start to engage in a much bigger way. I think the first time one of these molecules gets approved, whether it's psilocybin from Compass or Usona, or Lykos, gets their additional phase 3 done and gets it in front of the FDA. Once that happens, I think that will be the major moment. The proof of concept has happened. You have a bunch of these small kind of startup pharma companies. I am certainly not a business expert, but I feel like if I were a multinational conglomerate, like you see from like Johnson and Johnson or Pfizer, the thought
Mhm.
of like, oh, well, let's just acquire this new business unit and we don't need to start over. We can just do it. I think is a really realistic expectation for what's going to happen, or
Mhm.
that they immediately begin working on their own generic or comparable version of it. There are many things that can be said about pharma, most of them critical, but one of the I think silver linings is they're not going to miss out on a profit opportunity or a market opportunity, and so I think they are absolutely going to take it, and they're just waiting for the next thing. We don't need to go in depth, but AbbVie's deal with Gilgamesh, I think, is a really, really instructive model for what you may see happen. I also am reminded a little bit of the way that things work in the oil patch in Texas. During good times, you have a lot of expansion. During bust times, right, you have contraction. But a lot of that expansion looks like the major oil and gas companies acquiring smaller exploration companies, right? And so you have all the smarter startups. They do the work. They get it above this level, and then the big behemoth comes and acquires them. And that is my speculation for what I think is going to happen in like psychedelic pharma development.
That's generally how I use a software analogy because that's my background. But like I
Oh,
think
okay. Yeah.
there's a lot there. Like you develop all this IP, this other group can make way more money off of it than you can. They buy it, and
Yeah.
yeah, and why wouldn't they? So yeah, I'm expecting to see a lot of M&A activity in the next year.
Yeah.
I think you're spot on that once we see FDA approval on one, we're going to see an acceleration. Um, yeah, I would hope it comes before that though, because the results are so promising. We just keep getting breakthrough designation status on these molecules. Like,
Hmm.
that to me is the signal. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm hopeful. Um, so Logan, what else do we maybe miss that's really important that people are curious about here?
Um, wow. That might be the hardest question you've asked me this whole time.
Because there's too much.
Because there's too much. Yeah, there's too
Yeah.
much. If there's one thing that I have not gotten the chance to cover in a lot of podcasts or talks that we've done, because everything's so focused on what happened or what happened in Texas, or how did you get $50 million, which I would encourage all of you to keep buying gas, because that gives Texas more money, and then we will spend it on psychedelic research. Um, uh, but is the kind of the role of a bunch of different advocacy organizations a model that I'm really passionate about, which is the state model. I think a lot of people see all of this happening and they wonder, how can I get involved? And their first thought is, I should go work at MAPS. I should go work with Brian Hubbard at Americans for Ibogaine. I should go join one of these national, mission-driven organizations. But what we've seen across the country is the really effective, really significant kind of surprise victories have been driven by people and organizations that are local to and dedicated to that state. You think about like the New Mexico psilocybin win that we got in this legislative session. That was of New Mexico, by New Mexico, for New Mexico. National partners didn't come in until that was already cruising. Texas, we had T4GMH. Hawaii has the Clarity Project. And so I just, if I can take a moment to get on a soapbox and plug
Please.
that if you're in a state and you want to see change, the most efficient and effective thing you can do is start to engage your state, find out who's on the ground and working in your state capital. If it's nobody, that generally means it's you. When you look around and wonder who's doing this and there's no one else and you have a passion and a commitment to it, then I think that kind of falls to you. And if there's already a state-based organization, join up with them and see how you can help. Everything from volunteering at events, writing letters to members of the legislature, calling, if you're comfortable showing up and going to meetings and kind of telling your story, because these wins the big wins have all been driven by folks who are from those states, who care about those states, who have a personal connection to them. And so I think that's something that kind of gets missed a lot as people talk about, and I talk about vets, for example, right? But so often vets is collaborating with other organizations to get the win. And a lot of times it's local state orgs led by local leaders.
Yeah. And one thing at Aspen I was really inspired by was just how excited lawmakers were. People, elected officials in the room saying, snarky stuff to me off the record. Well, I didn't ask to go on the record with them, but they just didn't know who I was. And we're talking shit about Suboxone and like kind of the racket around Suboxone. I'm pro Suboxone, everybody, but there's limits, and there's a lot of issues around it. And, just hearing lawmakers have that kind of sophisticated knowledge and talking points, which I don't expect a lot from politicians. It was really great to get.
Nor should you.
Yeah. It was really great to hear that and oh, okay, you guys understand that we need a new holistically appropriate system, and that people are just conning us as taxpayers regularly. Yeah. And we could do so much better. I think at the end of the day, that's kind of the thing. Yeah. Maybe no utopia, but we could do so much better.
We can do better. Yeah, we can absolutely do better. We're doing better now than we were a few decades ago, and we'll be doing a lot better a few decades from now than we are now. And yeah, those politicians who get it, who see the change, and there were a lot of them in Aspen. I think there were even more who couldn't quite make the trip. Not to shamelessly push this again, but they're looking for someone from their state to come walk arm in arm with them, who can push from outside the legislature while they push from inside it. And so I know you've got a lot of listeners, and yeah, it's a question I get a lot is how do I get involved? And I think in a big way, stop looking for a seat at the table and just grab your chair and pull it on up.
Yeah. I told a friend the same thing. I was like, hey, I could probably get you on that board. Do you want it? Wait, really? I was like, yeah, it's not hard. People need help. Not enough people are stepping up. It's not all that competitive. And well-intentioned people with some energy to spare, please do it. This is an all hands on deck moment, kind of always has been, but we can do a lot here in the next couple of years to do a lot of good. I'm trying to check my notes here. Final thing, and hopefully this is relatively clean, but the idea of what does this deal look like for states? So we've got Texas and a few other states jumping in. Hopefully a big pharma group will jump in, a Texas university will be attached, and what kind of benefits do states get, and is there I guess what is the hopeful long-term benefit look like to states in this kind of a participatory model?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, outside of the benefit of getting Brian Hubbard to come to your state and getting to hear from him live, right? So the way the legislation is drafted is it kind of puts the onus currently on the developer and the applicants to say, give us the best deal that you see realistic for the states. I think there's a couple of things that could come into play. In each state, we'll see how it goes. There may eventually become a standard model where it's just copy paste across every state. But likely the thing is it'll be a little bit different for every single state. Things that I know have been proposed are, discounted, lower, no cost access to the treatment, for patients in that state, right? So that's one of the things that's come up certainly in conversations about Texas. Texas put the money in to maybe develop this pharmaceutical. So at the end of the road, Texas patients will have access to it cheaper. There's also conversations around revenue sharing, seeing a return on their investment, either just up to the amount they invested or maybe even more, royalty payments, that kind of thing. And I think if you see the full vision of what is possible here, which is, I don't think you'd ever get to 50, but a really significant, geographically, ideologically diverse set of states that come together to do this. Say you've got a, West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington joining up with the Mountain West and Colorado and Nevada and all the way across into the deep South and up into the Northeast.
Mm-hmm.
Then you start to have a really substantial conversation about changing the way drugs are researched and developed and doing it in a way that houses a lot of that authority and benefit in the states. We're not there yet, but that, I think, is going back to something we said a little bit earlier about the entire space. So much of this is being written right now. There's so much innovation that's going to happen. I made an analogy last year in a conversation with a bunch of people at a conference that, like, we're staring at a blank page, and it's an incredible burden and an incredible opportunity. And we're going to put some things on the page that don't work, and we'll cross those out, and we'll keep trying new things. But those are the kind of the key benefits to the states that I understand from the way the Ibogaine initiative can go, is some revenue and then also reducing the cost. And then the final point is that revenue can then go to support all kinds of public services. A portion of any revenue Texas gets is dedicated to veteran services in the state. You could see the same thing happen in states that maybe were hit a little bit harder or had more acute experiences with the opioid crisis, supporting traditional wraparound treatments there or emergency intervention, or even start to see, a lot of times there's a casino in your state, the tax revenue from that goes to public safety. So what does it mean when that revenue generator for your state is is a pharmaceutical that's helping heal people? Dream no small dreams, right? Be as flexible and innovative as you want. Go to your legislature and say, I think this is a good idea. They don't have many good ideas in legislatures, so bring your good one, and I'm sure folks will engage with it in a really positive way.
Yeah. And I think finally on that, to extend that point, you made a great point, Aspen, about just the energy of the local community being engaged and having local champions is hard to overstate. You can fly in people from out of state, but so what? What about that guy that's in every single meeting?
Oh yeah. Oh man, I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I, as a staffer in the Texas House, would have a meeting with someone who wasn't from Texas, and I can admit I absolutely took that meeting in a different context than I would have if they were from here. There's a big attitude. If you're not from around here, what are you doing in our legislature? If you're from Texas and you're in Nebraska, you're going to get the question, what are you doing in Nebraska? But if you are from that state and passionate and especially a community leader, and that doesn't necessarily mean you hold some elected position or appointed position, maybe you're just a good neighbor and a good friend, and you coach your little league team. And so when someone sees you leading on this initiative, it creates a permission structure for them to get involved, but also exposes them to this from a totally trusted, credible messenger that otherwise wouldn't exist. And we've got local leaders all over the country. I've mentioned a couple of them, but from the Ibogaine perspective, you've got Sally Roberts in North Carolina, Nate Morgans in Oklahoma, Ricky in Tennessee, Chase in Texas, who have really taken up the mantle of this cause and said, we're willing to put our reputation on the line. We're willing to, do the interviews, show up on podcasts and post more on our social media accounts. And those are the things that really drive change. It all comes together. Identifying any one thing is a bit of a fallacy because it requires everything. Every single player on the basketball court is necessary to get a win. Or a football field. If you're a fan of Texas Tech football, every player on the field is going to get us a win. But that's a really impactful one. That's someone who maybe walks away with the game ball, is that local leader who leverages that credibility and those local relationships.
Yeah, I love that. All right, Logan, where can people find you online?
You can find me at Logan Davidson TX. That's my handle on Instagram and Twitter. But really, if you want to keep track of me and the work that I'm doing, at T4 GMH is Texans for Greater Mental Health, and then at Vet Solutions is Vets, and you can see all the incredible work being done on the advocacy space with those organizations.
Amazing, Logan. Thanks so much for your efforts. Thanks for joining us today, and hope we get to do it again.
Absolutely, Joe. This was great. Looking forward to the next time.
Thanks.